Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's session, How Changing Demographics Will Impact America's Urban Revival. We had a wonderful run-up to this with the luncheon discussion, for sure. I particularly like the analogy of we have to skate to where the puck is, and I think our speakers today are going to show us how to do that. We are, of course, given the nature of this discussion, focusing on reinventing older communities, and particularly in the United States and particularly in the Northeast and the Middle West. But I would also like to make a point here about how, yes, we're very much focused on this, but we are also part of a larger global community of cities around the world that are, of course, experiencing different trajectories and rates of urbanization. And in particular, when we think about reinventing industrial communities today, we think about industrial communities that have developed over 100 years, and they're now dealing with decline because of globalization, because of movements throughout the United States and movements throughout the world. But we should also remember that there's a tremendous amount of industrial decline occurring at a much faster trajectory throughout the world. It used to be that Korea was a major source of heavy industry. All that has moved to another place. It is now seeking to do similar things to what we are doing here in the United States and reinventing their cities. So we should really appreciate the fact that many of the issues that we are discussing today are issues that are being discussed worldwide, and that the issues of the elderly, the aging, the age distribution, the issues of migrants, the issues of informal and formal economies within our older industrial cities are issues that are being faced worldwide. We should remember, of course, that the United States is 83% urban, and its urban activities occur on 5% of the land, and here are some of our top cities. Many of the other countries of the world aren't quite so urban, but they're fast going to be so, such that by the middle of the century, we should probably be 3/4 urban globally. We will be a variety of cities that will have different kinds of backgrounds and activities. As we think about this, something is going on in the world that I thought I should alert you to because you might be interested in knowing about it, which is the United Nations is about to issue a new framework for sustainable development. And this framework will replace the Millennium Development Goals that were issued in 2000. They will expire in 2015. And as they expire, the United Nations has decided that the goals this time should not be focusing just on the developing world as the Millennium Development Goals were, but they should be focusing worldwide. And in the discussions right now that are occurring about these goals, there is a proposal to have a standalone goal on cities with wording such as you see in front of you, building inclusive, safe, sustainable cities and human settlements, and dealing with targets within this goal that will be very much addressing some of the concerns that this whole conference will be addressing in the next 2 days, particularly thinking about urban form and urban functions, particularly thinking about the urban-rural linkages. I was much interested in a discussion at lunch when someone was talking about the Pennsylvania state education policy, which used to give favorable funding to urban places, which has since been repealed. So these issues of urban and rural linkages exist as much in our places here, that older industrial cities, as they do throughout the world. We have a lot of discussions about what does sprawl mean and the efficiencies that we need to deal with, in particular when Angela Glover Blackwell was talking about transportation and how transportation investments affect opportunity, equality, and the movement of people. It's not just here, it's around the world. We all have to be thinking about resilience and what that's going to mean in terms of how we form and shape our cities. Affordable housing is absolutely critical, as we well know, in terms of supporting the growing labor force that we want to support. having transportation that is, again, works for those and provides the opportunities that we need. And lastly, thinking about public space and what that will do to help contribute to the social cohesion, to the social capital that was pointed out as something that was so very important as we thought about how you bridge opportunity and growth. And just to keep you up to date on this, this framework is actually being created and will be pretty much finalized by July of this year, when the Subcommittee of the United Nations is asked to produce its recommendations and send them on to the General Assembly. They'll wait a year and they'll vote on them. You should know that having an SDG on cities is not a sure thing. Believe it or not, there are many nations in the world who do not think that this spatial attention to place, as we heard today from our speakers, many nations don't think this is important. So I think as we go through our proceedings today and remember how place is important, we need to think about how we can support a global consensus on this particular item. And our speakers today are certainly going to be doing that as they look at demography. They'll be dealing with issues of inclusion. They'll be dealing with issues of exclusion. They'll be dealing with issues of, do we conduct our activities as a business as usual practices, or are we going to be thinking about how we can create the places that are going to promote the inclusion and move to prosperity and bridging opportunity and growth. So we're really privileged to have today with us two wonderful experts. Elizabeth Kneebone is a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution and co-author of the book Confronting Suburban Poverty in America. Her work primarily focuses on the urban and suburban poverty, metropolitan demographics, and tax policies that support the situation, in particular tax policies that affect low-income workers and communities. Before joining Brookings, Elizabeth was a research project manager for the Illinois Facilities Fund, where her work was very place-based. She assessed the geographic distribution of services and programs that were targeted to low-income people and places. Elizabeth holds a master's degree in public policy from the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy and a bachelor's degree in history in Indiana University. That makes her particularly equipped to discuss her topic today, which will be focusing on immigration. Elizabeth?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I think my remarks today are going to help set the stage for Marge's comments later about policy and place-based, place-conscious strategies. And what I'm going to do in my remarks is really talk about something we heard a lot about in the afternoon or session that kicked us off today. And that's the transformational change that's happening across this country. As I think we heard Manuel mention, we are on track to become a majority-minority country, and that's actually happening faster than originally expected. By 2012, about half of kids under 5 were minority residents, and by 2043, we expect the entire country to be majority-minority. At the same time, we've seen a lot of economic change in this country as well. We remain stuck at a historic high in terms of the number of people living below the federal poverty line, and over 1/3 of the population in this country lives below twice the federal poverty level. We've also seen, as we heard in great detail over lunch, inequality has grown. It's actually at peak levels. It's surpassing the peak that we saw before the Depression in the 1920s. And we've seen a lot of issues around mobility and how many people are stuck at a very sticky bottom part of the distribution. But the thing with all of these changes, which I also think we heard so well articulated earlier today, is that they're not happening evenly across the country. They're playing out differently depending on where you live and what part of the country you're looking at. When we think about population change, in fact, it's our 100 largest metro areas that have been growing fastest, and we're concentrating a lot of our population growth within those communities. They currently account for about 2/3 of the nation's population. And they've been growing faster in the post-recession period than our smaller metropolitan areas. And in fact, our counties outside of metropolitan communities have lost population in recent years. And we're also seeing changes within these regions as well. I think we've heard a lot about the resurgence of cities in recent years. Big places like Atlanta, Boston, Washington, D.C., which are now growing faster than their suburbs for the first time in decades. But that's not to say that our suburban communities aren't still growing. And in fact, they are becoming much more diverse, both demographically and economically. And a lot of my remarks today are going to be talking about how we've seen a lot of these communities transforming over time. For instance, for the first time in the 2000s, within our major metropolitan areas, we now saw more African American residents living in suburbs than in big cities. And with that change, it is now true that every major racial and ethnic group is majority in suburban communities within our major metropolitan areas. We've also seen immigration tip towards the suburbs increasingly in recent years as new arrivals are bypassing cities altogether and settling in suburban communities. About 61% of immigrants in our nation's major metros lived in the suburbs by the end of the 2000s. And we've also seen suburbs gray faster than cities. The elderly population, the population's over 65 years old, grew by 19% in our suburban communities over the 2000s, compared to a 3% growth in big cities. So almost 3/4 of our population over 65 in our major metro areas live in suburban communities. And also, particularly striking for today's conversation is the shift that we've seen in the geography of poverty, particularly in recent years. So we saw poverty grow across all kinds of communities in the 2000s, as we saw the impact of 2 recessions and 2 very sluggish recoveries. But it's very striking in the way that the geography and map of poverty has changed. Suburbs in our major metro areas saw the poor population grow by 65% between 2000 and 2012. That's more than twice the pace of growth that occurred in the big cities that anchor these regions. So for the first time, we now have more poor residents living in suburbs, 3 million more poor than in big cities. And for the first time, suburbs are home to the largest poor population in the country. And this is something that has been happening across our major metro areas. 93 out of our 95 biggest metros saw their suburban poor population grow in the 2000s. So it's touching places that were hit hard by the foreclosure crisis, Sunbelt communities like Atlanta and Las Vegas. But we're also seeing it in stronger markets like Seattle, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and in older industrial regions that we've longer associated with urban poverty. Places like Detroit and Cleveland, Chicago, all saw rapid increases in their suburban poor population and in fact now locate more poor residents outside their big cities. And I also want to point out here that this isn't something that's just happening in older inner ring suburbs either. Those places continue to struggle with poverty at higher rates, but we also saw poverty growing further out in regions, in exurban communities, less densely populated communities, more affluent areas that we often think of as immune to these trends, which just really underscores the increasingly regional scope of poverty across our major metro areas. But at the same time that poverty has been regionalizing across the country, it's also been concentrating. So we've seen more and more poor residents living in pockets of poverty, in high poverty neighborhoods, what we would consider census tracts with 40% poverty rates or higher. And we saw some of the fastest growth in concentrated poverty occurring, again, in suburban communities and in smaller metro areas where the number of residents facing that double burden of being poor in a very poor place more than doubled in just the span of a decade. Now we know that concentrated poverty, the rates of concentrated poverty remain higher in big cities. This is still an urban challenge. It's still something that cities are grappling with and continuing to struggle with. But it's something that we increasingly see facing other communities as well. Suburban areas where now more than 1/3 of the poor population lives in a neighborhood with 20% poverty rates or more. Smaller metro areas where we saw the concentrated poverty rate rise by more than 5 percentage points. So more and more places are dealing with poverty and dealing with concentrated poverty as well, which brings so many additional challenges. And there are a lot of reasons why we're seeing these shifts, why we've seen this sort of change, particularly the rapid shifts that we saw in the 2000s. A couple of the factors that we've explored in our work at Brookings are these things that we talked about already. Population change. As places have grown, as suburban communities have grown, they become more diverse, both demographically and economically. Immigration is part of this trend, although I would underscore that while immigrants were about 30% of growth in suburbs over the 2000s, they only contributed about 17% of the growth in the poor population in suburbs. So this has been a largely native-born trend that we've seen across the country. Part of what's also helping to shape these trends are shifts in the housing market. I mean, for one, we talk about the resurgence of cities. We know that there are a number of regions where housing price pressures in redeveloping city neighborhoods are leading more people to look further out in the region for more affordable options. You have suburban communities with aging housing stock that are becoming more affordable over time as people move further out in the region. And we've also seen things like vouchers, the use of subsidies and portable housing choice vouchers increasingly being used in suburban communities. By the end of the 2000s, in our major metro areas, about half of housing choice voucher residents lived in the suburbs. And of course, in this sphere of housing, we also know the impact of the foreclosure crisis was quite severe in many suburban communities. So that easy credit boom in the 2000s, where we saw that spike in subprime lending, about 3/4 of subprime loans happened in the suburbs of our major metro areas. And since the collapse of the housing market, about 3/4 of foreclosures have occurred in those communities as well. We've also seen jobs helping to shape these trends. Almost every major metro area saw jobs continue to shift outward in their regions over the 2000s. And some of the most suburbanized industries are things like services, retail, construction, manufacturing. So jobs that may pay lower wages, but also industries that were hit hard by the downturn, especially with the housing-led nature of this recession. So that suburbs, more so than in the past, have borne the brunt of this downturn alongside cities. But I do want to underscore that it's not just the recession that has created this shift or this tipping point that we've seen in suburban communities, because we've also been facing structural changes that are leading to the creation of more and more jobs that don't pay very much. So even if you're working full-time, if you're a home health aide, for instance, or a child care provider, industries that are growing quickly but won't pay enough to keep a family above the poverty line even if you're working full-time. So that's just to say that these structural changes suggest that this is not a temporary shift we're seeing in terms of the suburbanization of poverty, but indeed a long-running challenge that is going to be facing many of these places. And so what does that mean? Now that we've seen poverty touching more people in more places, the challenge for a lot of these communities that don't have a long history of dealing with these issues is that they're not very well equipped, and there can be additional challenges facing the communities and people who are now finding themselves dealing with growing poverty. For one, we know that public transportation is less present in suburban communities. You're less likely to have access to a bus or a train to begin with if you're in a low-income neighborhood in the suburbs, and you're less connected to the regional jobs via that transit system. So within a 90-minute commute from a low-income neighborhood in the suburbs, on average, a resident can reach about 25% of a region's jobs. If you drop that commute time to 45 minutes, the share of jobs reachable drops to 4%. So that can create a lot of challenges around spatial mismatches if you can't afford to live near where the jobs are growing. We've also seen challenges arise in a lot of these communities that don't have the same sort of safety net supports built up or put in place that cities have been able to develop over time. The suburban safety net tends to be much thinner and patchier than what's been developed in most major cities over the decades. And they've also seen a really rapid increases in demand for services at times where budgets are often flat or shrinking. And many suburban providers have reported that they're seeing a lot more people come in who've never had to seek assistance before. They've never had connections with the safety net and are now coming in after they've exhausted every other option and have multiple critical needs, making it that much more challenging to help triage and meet the needs of this growing population. We have also seen that the lag in philanthropic resources in part contributes to this lack of capacity in suburban communities. Most dollars aimed at addressing issues that affect low-income populations still are disproportionately targeted to cities in major metro areas and haven't kept up with this rapid shift. But we know that this is a bit of a chicken and an egg challenge. Many funders who've been looking to try and fund in suburbs often have difficulty finding a provider who can be competitive in the grant process. But then again, there are few resources that are going to building capacity in suburbs. So we have this cycle of how do you then break that and make sure we're growing the sorts of capacity and supports that are needed to address this rapidly growing need. And we've also seen the impact that this has had on schools in a suburban context. The share or the number of kids on free and reduced price lunch has grown at a more rapid pace in suburbs than in cities in recent years, often again when resources and budgets have not kept pace with that need. And you put that in the context of a weak safety net in many of these suburban communities, and schools are on the front lines of these challenges. They have families coming in who are looking for help and aren't sure where to find it. Many schools are stretching as far as they can to build wraparound supports so that they can meet the basic needs of the kids they're trying to educate. Things like clothing pantries, food pantries, medical and dental services even. A wide range of issues that they're trying to address just so their kids can then be ready to learn and be successful in their education goals. In addition, the suburban context in places that are often dealing with rapid rising poverty, particularly where they haven't addressed this in the past, are often facing additional challenges like a lack of capacity. And we talked about philanthropy, we talked about nonprofits, but this is from a municipal perspective or a county perspective. They may not have the staff in place or the structures in place to address a rapidly growing low-income population. And you know, we often say suburbs like it's one thing, but this is a really diverse array of places, and suburbia can be quite fragmented, particularly in the Midwest and Northeast and older areas that have many more incorporated places. You may be talking about dozens or hundreds of communities, school districts, counties that are all trying to grapple with these trends, but may not actually have the scale or ability to meet the growing need and deal with issues that, frankly, are regional in their scope and provenance. And finally, they're often dealing with these challenges in a resource environment where we're looking at inflexible and unreliable funding for these issues. We looked at the federal framework in terms of what do we spend on place-based funding that is meant to fight poverty in the context of communities. And we found that actually there are $82 billion the federal government spends each year on place-based programs. But that money is actually fragmented across 10 different agencies and 81 different programs. So this is a very fragmented and difficult to navigate system, which in most cases was built with a very different geography of poverty in mind. Many of these programs were built to address distressed inner city neighborhoods, and it can be quite difficult to get them to be flexible enough to map onto a suburban context. So it raises a number of different challenges for stakeholders and communities trying to grapple with the increasingly regional scope with a fairly legacy and fragmented system. But I think the positive things that we've seen in our travels around the country and the work that we've been doing in regions across the U.S. is that there's a lot of leadership coming from the local level in a lot of places that are trying to find more effective ways to deal with the growth of poverty in cities and suburbs alike. And what we're seeing is there are often communities or leaders or organizations that are able to play what we call the role of the regional quarterback, to borrow a phrase from David Erickson and his colleagues at the San Francisco Fed. These regional quarterbacks that can help braid together this very fragmented system, bring in private dollars and philanthropic investments, and help stretch these resources to help more people in more places at the same time. And the types of things that we're seeing crop up in different places across the country. There's definitely no one cookie cutter approach. It's clear that this takes a wider range of strategies to deal with a very diverse group of places that are dealing with these challenges. But what we've seen that has been similar across these different innovative examples that we found in different regions is that they all manage to do three things. One, they're working at a more effective scale, either geographically or in terms of the continuum of services and issues addressed. Two, they're more collaborative and integrated, so they're cutting across jurisdictional boundaries and policy silos for a more comprehensive approach to these issues. And they're figuring out how to fund more strategically. And that means being able to leverage public and private dollars in ways that put more of a focus on outcome and try to find more flexible resources to achieve those outcomes. And this, again, comes back to, I think, what we heard a lot at lunch, data, being able to not only map where the need is and where it's moving, but actually demonstrate what's working so that we can align funding to support those types of strategies and use limited resources more efficiently. So these are the types of strategies that I think is what is going to help us pave a way to a more modernized system for dealing with place-based and place-conscious strategies. And that's what Marge's remarks are really going to dig into in more detail. But before I turn it over, I also want to offer another resource. As mentioned earlier, my colleague Alan Bruby and I published a book last year. In fact, it was May 20th, so almost a year ago, called Confronting Suburban Poverty in America. And on the website, we chronicle a lot of these innovative cases and models that we've seen in our travels across the country. And we're continuing to build to that warehouse and sort of clearinghouse of examples to help share models of the innovative strategies that are happening at the local level that really can teach state and federal policymakers how to more effectively lift up place-conscious strategies that work region-wide. So I would recommend, or if you have an opportunity to check out these resources on the website or sign up for our newsletter, we'd be happy to keep sharing these strategies and this information, keep this conversation going, so we really can bring our policy and practice framework into the 21st century to address today's map of poverty and opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That is really illustrative and certainly indicative of some of the challenges before us. Not only do we have to think about regional approaches to what we're talking about when we're talking about metropolitan growth and moving towards prosperity, but also maybe we ought to go back and think about a national urban policy. Just want to suggest that might be something that we should be considering, which we have projected over the years, and we're going to turn to Margery, who is going to tell us more about how we might be building prosperity through place-conscious strategies. But before she comes up, let me give you a little of her wonderful background. Margery Austin Turner is a Senior Vice President for Program Planning and Management at the Urban Institute, where she leads efforts to frame and conduct policy research. She is a nationally recognized expert on urban policy and neighborhood issues, and she has analyzed such issues concerning residential location, residential and ethnic discrimination, and its contribution to neighborhood segregation and inequality, what we've heard a lot of today, and the role of housing policies in promoting residential mobility and location choice. A few years ago, Ms. Turner was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Research at HUD, and during that time she focused HUD's research agenda on the problems of racial discrimination, poverty, and economic opportunity in America's metropolitan areas. In her tenure, HUD's research office launched 3 major social science demonstration projects to test different strategies for helping families from distressed inner-city neighborhoods access opportunities through employment and education. So we have a well-experienced analyst who is going to help us today. Margery.
Thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it was really wonderful to hear that lunch conversation. 3 of my favorite people talking together. Could have lasted a lot longer. So what I'm going to do today is talk about some thinking I've been doing about how strategies that I've characterized as place-conscious as opposed to place-based might begin to help us advance this combination of opportunity and growth that we're discussing today. So let's start with the problem that is pretty typical of older urban communities. Historically, very high housing costs have intersected with discriminatory market practices and exclusionary land use policies to block low-income families, and particularly people of color, from the communities that offer safety, good schools, a healthy environment, access to jobs. So at the same time as that exclusion has been happening, many of the neighborhoods where housing is more affordable have been victims of disinvestment and neglect, leaving them with failing schools, inadequate services, physical and environmental blight, and high levels of crime and violence. So those long-standing consequences, those long-standing dynamics, we know have very serious consequences, because where we live matters. It matters to the well-being of our families, and most importantly, the conditions in the most severely distressed neighborhoods have been shown to undermine both the quality of daily life and the long-term life chances of our kids. And there's emerging evidence now offered most forcefully, I think, by Patrick Sharkey that suggests that living in these high-poverty neighborhood environments undermines outcomes not just for one generation, but across generations. So I was very explicit in saying that this problem of poverty in place has two sides, exclusion on the one hand and disinvestment on the other. But very often, too often, I think, the goals of inclusion, also known as fair housing, and the goals of community development have been pursued separately. The fair housing movement has focused primarily on breaking down the barriers that exclude lower-income people, and particularly people of color, from predominantly white neighborhoods. While community development advocates and practitioners have focused primarily on changing conditions within the boundaries of distressed neighborhoods. So some people characterize these two approaches as people versus place, as if one or the other ought to win out and vanquish the other side of the versus. And indeed, there have long been tensions between these goals and their respective constituencies. For example, in decisions about whether or not to invest in the preservation of affordable housing that's located in distressed or marginal neighborhoods. In decisions about whether to help low-income families move to non-poor neighborhoods or to prioritize the redevelopment of neighborhoods where they are currently concentrated. And in arguments about how much income mixing is desirable or feasible in housing developments and in neighborhoods. So that's our history. At lunch, Charles Plosser used a quote that I've heard a lot in the last few years, which is, we need to skate to where the puck is going to be. And Elizabeth's presentation helped us understand some of the dimensions about where the puck is going. Looking ahead, it's clear that sweeping demographic as well as economic trends are underway that are going to be transforming our housing markets and our communities. Elizabeth emphasized the changing patterns of poverty, and I'm not going to restate her terrific findings. I want to emphasize the accompanying set of trends that over the next 3 or 4 decades, members of the baby boom generation, which I am one of, will be handing off our housing and our communities to a much more diverse and currently much less wealthy cohort. This handoff has already begun, but it's really going to accelerate over the next couple of decades as my generation retires, downsizes our housing, and as my colleague Rolf Pendle very graciously says, we release our housing. These trends, I think, could really seriously intensify existing neighborhood disparities. They could tip more neighborhoods into a downward spiral of disinvestment and distress. But they could also, if effectively managed with some foresight and some strategic thinking, they could really open up opportunities for much greater inclusion and diversity than we've seen historically. So as I think Elizabeth indicated, and we also heard at lunch today, this demographic transition is playing out in dramatically different ways in different parts of the country. And it's already contributing to a divergence of city and metropolitan futures, with some cities and their metros really struggling, while others are thriving or struggling with the challenges of prosperity. So I think these evolving and divergent urban futures intensify the need for the next generation of strategies to focus both on the revitalization of distressed communities and on the removal of barriers that exclude or displace people from thriving, opportunity-rich communities. I really think that instead of battling over scarce resources, the advocates for fair and open housing and the advocates for community revitalization need to figure out how to collaborate to craft larger strategies that advance both sets of goals. And I think there's a possibility that regulations under final review at HUD could create a window of opportunity for this kind of shared framework. So a little background. State and local governments that receive federal funding from HUD have always been obligated to affirmatively further the purposes of the Federal Fair Housing Act. But almost for the entire history of the Federal Fair Housing Act, efforts to enforce that obligation have been extremely weak. Under these new regs that HUD has released in draft and is now reviewing and getting close to finalizing, HUD will be providing data and a template which states and localities must use to complete a formal, evidence-based assessment of fair housing in their community, where fair housing is very broadly defined, and I'll explain how HUD is defining it in a second. But once they have done that assessment, their subsequent plans for using their HUD dollars must link to that assessment and must include actions that affirmatively further fair housing. So the way HUD is defining fair housing in its guidance sets 4 goals, which I think really explicitly link this idea of community revitalization with the idea of opening up closed communities, combating discrimination and segregation. So it's putting the community development together with the fair housing in these goals, which are overcoming historic patterns of residential segregation and promoting more integrated neighborhoods, reducing concentrations of poverty, particularly minority poverty, narrowing the disparities in access to assets and in exposure to environmental hazards, and responding to the disproportionate housing needs of racial and ethnic minorities. So if we're going to be serious about advancing those 4 aspirations, we clearly need interventions that tackle both residential exclusion on the one hand and neighborhood distress on the other hand. So more specifically, if these regs are effectively implemented, and that's a big if, jurisdictions all across the country are going to be held accountable for reducing the barriers that shut low-income people and people of color out of communities that function well, that have great opportunities and great assets. And they will also be responsible for reducing the barriers that currently undermine the well-being of neighborhoods where poor people currently live. Advocates will have standing to challenge local zoning, local land use regulations, and local occupancy policies, as well as the allocation of federal resources. And nonprofit developers are going to be looking for models about how to produce affordable housing in communities that have previously seemed completely off limits. Now, we all know there's no guarantee that HUD is going to implement these new regulations effectively, or that they will survive a change of administration. But I think they create an important opening and an impetus for fair housing and community development practitioners and advocates to join forces around a shared framework of actions and investments that integrate their fundamental goals. And I think it's in the interest of both those movements to begin working together, whether HUD is able to enforce this new regulation effectively or not. And I've been referring to this integrated approach as place conscious as opposed to place-based. And I want to sketch 6 principles that kind of distinguish this place-conscious approach, and many of these echo the points Elizabeth made about emerging regional strategies for tackling poverty. So first, although the evidence that place matters a lot is very compelling, I don't think either researchers or practitioners have given enough attention to defining the scale at which particular conditions affect outcomes for people. So there are some cases where interventions can really have their greatest impact by focusing at a very small scale, at the block level, in the development, the walk between somebody's home and their school. But there are other instances in which it makes much more sense to intervene across a larger geography. Could be a larger neighborhood, a school enrollment area, or an entire region. Second, I think very traditionally, people who care about neighborhoods have acted on an implicit vision that a neighborhood, to be successful, functions like an incubator for its residents, especially its low-income residents. So that if it's working well, their incomes rise, they do better, they stay in the neighborhood that they love, and the whole neighborhood rises together. But that isn't the only possible vision of how a neighborhood can work effectively for its residents. We can also imagine neighborhoods that might serve really effectively as launch pads. Poor people live in them for a little while. They have such great services and linkage and sort of boosting capacities that people's incomes rise, and they move on to another place to be replaced by a next cohort of low-income families taking advantage of all those terrific launchpad services. That neighborhood would keep looking very poor, but it could be functioning incredibly well in the Raj Chetty sense that we talked about at lunch. Third principle is that many of the services and the opportunities families need to thrive are located outside their neighborhoods, and that often interventions can do better by connecting people to opportunities regionally than by trying to build all those opportunities inside the boundaries of the neighborhood. Fourth, I think we're more and more recognizing that variations in city and regional dynamics, demographic dynamics, economic dynamics, really influence neighborhood outcomes. And so, it's a truism, but an easy one to forget, that one size really does not fit all. And I think a lot of us are beginning to look at some of the fast-growing metros of the South and Southwest and see that the opportunity structure and the characteristics of poor neighborhoods are really different from what we're used to seeing and working in the older industrial cities of the Northeast and the Midwest. Fifth principle is that residential mobility plays a hugely important and complicating role in the effectiveness of neighborhood revitalization efforts. So people, especially low-income people, move a lot. And one response to that mobility in a neighborhood revitalization effort is to try to reduce involuntary mobility, reduce the kind of churning that goes on in the lives of low-income families, so that if families who want to stay in a neighborhood and take advantage of the services there can stay and offer some stability and security for their kids. But a place-conscious strategy, I think, would partner that kind of stability strategy with an assisted mobility strategy, so that families who are ready to move, who want to move to a different kind of neighborhood, can do so. And finally, sixth principle here is that we are crazy if we think that federal housing subsidies are going to expand substantially enough in the foreseeable future to really tackle the housing needs of low and moderate income families. I mean, I'm sad to say this, but I think it's realistic. So advocates and practitioners for inclusion and revitalization have to look beyond subsidy programs and find ways to expand the production, the financing, the operation of moderately priced housing by the private for-profit sector. Looking ahead, I really believe that our success or our failure in overcoming the challenges of neighborhood exclusion and neighborhood distress will help determine the kind of country we become in the decades ahead. Already, as we heard at lunch, alarms are sounding about worsening inequality and about persistently low levels of upward economic mobility. Raj Chetty's evidence about low mobility rates across this country kind of shake our notion of being the land where people who work hard can make it to the top. And as he said today, their analysis reveals very dramatic differences across metro areas across this country, and a very strong connection between residential racial segregation and poverty concentration in a metro area and how everybody in that metro area does in terms of upward mobility. So that new evidence, I think, really strengthens the case that a future of shared prosperity requires serious attention to this long-standing problem of poverty, place, and race in our country. Changing these stubborn spatial patterns requires strategies that tackle both the disinvestment and the distress that plague high poverty neighborhoods and the barriers that exclude low-income people and people of color from moving to neighborhoods of opportunity, neighborhoods where the opportunities for upward mobility are greater. I feel really strongly that we can't afford to keep thinking of these as competing goals. We can't keep talking about people versus place strategies when, in fact, they're so clearly interdependent and so clearly mutually reinforcing. Thanks.
Thank you very much for both of you for really informative talks. I have a question for you. You've both talked about the necessity of bringing things to scale. You've both talked about the integration of finding ways to improve opportunities. You've both largely focused on housing and some on transportation. We had a program, a national program called the Partnership for Sustainable Communities that attempted to bring together transportation, housing, and environmental policies and programs and funding for planning and for execution of this kind of integration, and we can't get Congress to fund it. So my question to you all is, how are we going to get this integration that everyone, I think, would agree that we need when we can't even get funding on an experimental program?
Do you want to start? That's an excellent question. I think there are a couple ways that I would answer that. One, the ability to, we are already seeing innovations across the country taking place. And it comes back to the ability to demonstrate the effectiveness of those experiments, of those innovative models that are emerging, because we are seeing cost savings, we are seeing improved outcomes from across different places. And I think being able to make the case that this is not a partisan agenda. This is, again, it's a shared issue that we all have to confront. And in fact, we can achieve goals of improving outcomes for low-income and minority residents, improve the prosperity of regions as well, and do it more effectively, using our limited resources more effectively and in more data-driven and research-driven ways. So there's a broader case to be made that can really benefit from what's already happening at the local level, where it's less stymied by congressional gridlock, where you already have leadership coming from local businesses, from local elected officials, from nonprofits and philanthropy, who are being really creative and strategic in how they're launching these new initiatives. And I had another point that I forget, so I'll let.
Well, do you want to give us some examples? Yeah. Do you want to give us some examples while you're talking about this? And then we'll turn to Margery.
Sure. Of some of the
innovations. What gives you hope?
Okay, that's great. You know, because there are a lot of models across the country that I think are pointing the way to how we can work more effectively moving forward. And so you have, for instance, I know an organization that Marge is also working with, neighborhood centers in the Houston metropolitan area. So this is from a human services model. It's a nonprofit that started as a settlement out of the settlement house movement. It's over 100 years old, but it has really evolved over time to grapple with today's issues in the Houston region. So it operates 70 different sites across the city and suburbs throughout the region, and it is very scaled in the types of services that it's able, so not just geographically, but in the types of services it's able to bring to these communities. It operates 35 different federal programs. It brings in philanthropic funds and private investments, and it really, really prides itself on a sort of data-driven, place-based approach. So it's not, again, a cookie-cutter solution, but they really take time to understand the needs of the diverse communities and what the community wants to achieve. It's a very aspirational model as well. What are the goals and the achievements that you want as a community? And then because of its scale in terms of services, it's able to craft the right fit for each site that it's operating. So it's using data, it's using community engagement, it's collaborating with other partners within the region to achieve these goals, and it's operating at a very effective scale. I also think it points the way to what kinds of improvements can happen at the federal level, in that in running these 35 different programs and bringing all these funding sources together, it has to operate 40 different data systems that are not allowed to talk to each other, they're not allowed to be integrated. It takes a lot of administrative time and resources to be able to operate at that kind of scale. And you can point to immediate savings and efficiencies that could be made by just streamlining some of those systems and allowing them to work more flexibly.
Who's paying for it now? There's 40 different data systems and so forth.
That's the administrative cost of running these different federal
They're just
programs.
pulling it out of their different resources that they, I mean, why them and nobody else? I mean, I was struck by the fact you've got $82 billion of place-based funding, 10 agencies and 81 federal programs to be coordinated if you wanted to at least deal with things at the national level. What's the magic sauce for Houston? How have they been able to do this and no one else?
I mean, it is, and I don't think that it's no one else is doing this. There are other scaled organizations across the country that are managing to bring together these, again, these sort of regional quarterbacks we mentioned that are able to bring together multiple resources. But they're all contending with this very fragmented system. And in fact, I mean, Angela Blanchard makes a joke that, you know how long it's taken us to figure this out, don't change it now, because we finally have all the pieces in place. But it's strong leadership from that organization, from Angela Blanchard, that has the vision of seeing the benefits of operating on that kind of model that allowed them to sort of develop to that sort of scale.
I actually think we should continue the Houston and neighborhood centers example for a little bit more, because part of what's impressive about neighborhood centers is its scale, the fact that it operates at a regional scale, so it's working in neighborhoods all over the region. But also what's impressive about it is it's working in this very different metropolitan environment than the one certainly that I am most familiar with. So it's a region of job growth, and in fact middle skill job growth. Immigrants are pouring into it. It's incredibly diverse and young. And the neighborhoods are very fluid, in part because Houston has no zoning, which is, has some downsides, but it has very fluid neighborhoods. So there are many things about the approaches neighborhood centers is taking that are really unfamiliar to more conventional community development organizations. And also that are quite unfamiliar to foundations, national foundations, and unfamiliar to the federal programs that put money into various kinds of initiatives. We've been working with Angela to begin to identify some other metros that are similar to Houston and some other organizations that might, even if they're not quite as big as neighborhood centers, they might be trying out some of those same ideas. And see if we can build a kind of community of practice so that you begin to, in Angela Glover Blackwell's words, we lift up some models that work in that kind of metropolitan area. And then you don't argue that those models work in every kind of metropolitan area. You help people think about what are the conditions in those metropolitan areas that make those models work, and begin to come up with some typologies of metros and places. I think then you go to the feds and to the national foundations and begin to start talking to them about, okay, here's what we're doing, and here's the kind of help we need to make it work. It's sort of not an indictment of this field that Congress isn't passing anything about it.
So you brought us an example that really doesn't apply to this region. And the focus of our conference here is really what are we going to do about reinventing older communities, and you brought us wonderful data about where the jobs are, where housing is, and so forth. What are we going to do here with regard to this? And since you've said that these very special conditions in Houston with a lot of job creation as well as residential considerations really don't apply here. So let's have an example for here.
I can bring another example that, again, there are ways to get to scale that doesn't mean one organization. It doesn't always have to be one organization like in neighborhood centers if not all regions have that. You can get to a better scale through collaboration, through working together. So for instance, in the south suburbs of Chicago, that is an area that has faced disinvestment for decades. They've lost steel jobs, manufacturing jobs. They've seen economic restructuring happening for a long time. They've also, in population stagnating and declining in many of those communities. And it's a place that was also hit hard by the foreclosure crisis and the more recent downturn. So you have this typical older industrial place, sub-region, let's say, within the Chicago metro area that's also incredibly fragmented. And what they did, which I think is really innovative, is following the foreclosure crisis, when most of the highest rates of foreclosure were focused in South Cook County. You had 19 communities decide to, instead of continuing competing against each other to try and get very limited resources, which many of them didn't even have the capacity to successfully compete for or implement, they decided to form a collaborative and work together to apply for federal funding. And with that, they benefited from some important support within the region. So their Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus had already sort of started this idea of communication and collaboration across places and thinking about housing at more of a regional level. But then they were also able to get technical assistance from their Metropolitan Planning Organization and support from a local community foundation to hire a coordinator that could actually help them build their capacity as a sub-region, creating a plan for how they were going to tackle the foreclosure crisis, but also think about economic development strategies. So beyond housing, how could they think about leveraging their assets? So things like their transit infrastructure, their cargo and freight capabilities, their connections to a lot of major rail and highways. So what are their ways that they could brand themselves as a sub-region working together as one point, a sort of single point of entry to bring investment and job creation into the region? So I think that's a really promising model about how to work in a very resource-constrained, capacity-constrained environment, but forward-thinking in terms of introducing economic growth as well.
So they were joined by desperation? That's what got them
together? It was absolutely the crisis. So is that? Yes, the crisis was the catalyst, and the neighborhood stabilization funds were the carrot that sort of brought them together. So you had this set of circumstances that helped bring them together, and they've since continued working together and applied in later iterations for additional funding to support, and Sustainable Communities Initiative, which you mentioned before, to support their planning process.
Are they able to reach out to some of the more affluent communities to help them join in this endeavor, or are they operating alone?
This collaborative structure is becoming I guess more popular is the right term. The West Side, which has a collection of more affluent communities, also form their own collaborative across a diverse array of places. So you have something like Oak Park, which has high capacity, but joined by other communities like Berwyn, which have much higher poverty rates and much more distressed communities working together. And then this is actually something the county has become a big supporter of within Cook County, and is encouraging other communities to form these sort of sub-regional clusters and try to, again, quit competing against each other individually, but work more strategically as collaboratives.
So will the collaboratives compete against each other?
Well, to some extent, they're applying for the same pool of funds, but they are supported by similar partners, which are able to share some of the lessons learned and the capacity building across collaboratives. So I still think there's a benefit to the larger region in working through these sort of models.
But lots to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Margery, do you want to talk about some of the work you did early on at HUD, some of the experiments that you were engaged in and the outcomes? Because it's been a while now. So.
Sure. So we launched three demonstrations, a couple of which may be very familiar to people, and one or two may be less so. So one of those demonstrations was the Moving to Opportunity demonstration. And the concept that it was testing was if you give very low-income families with kids the opportunity to use a voucher to move from a distressed public housing development to a low-poverty neighborhood, will they experience better outcomes over the long term? The second one was called Jobs Plus, and it said if you focus really intensive employment, training, work supports, and work incentives on the public housing developments that have very high unemployment rates and high poverty rates and distress? Will you be able to transform those into healthy working communities? And the third said, if you help the people who live in a poor, high unemployment neighborhood commute to jobs in the suburbs, find and commute to jobs in the suburbs, will you in effect revitalize the inner city neighborhood from which they came by bringing work and earnings back to the neighborhood? So sort of three different theories of change about how to tackle a common problem. So the Moving to Opportunity demonstration is widely known to have found that the girls and women who moved experienced huge gains in health and mental health. There were not gains recorded between the treatment group and the controls in employment or educational outcomes, and there's some concerns that boys may actually have suffered. So part of the challenge with those results is that, in fact, the people who moved did not get enough help to keep them in the low poverty neighborhoods to which they moved. Now, they didn't just go boomeranging back to the severely poor neighborhoods from which they came, but they kind of ended up in intermediate poverty neighborhoods. They mostly did not leave the Central City School District in which they started, and they stayed in majority-minority neighborhoods that were less poor than where they started. A number of us have done some additional analysis of the MTO results, and we find that for those families who managed to move to and stay in really low poverty neighborhoods for a longer period of time, you don't just get the women's health effects, you get educational improvements for boys and girls, and you get employment and earnings improvements that are significant. So I think what we learned from that is it's very hard to help people move out of distressed neighborhoods and get established and stay in opportunity-rich neighborhoods, but if you do it, there are payoffs for those families. The second Jobs Plus demonstration found that if you saturate a distressed, high unemployment community with really intensive, high-quality job services and incentives, you do get a big bump up, a significant bump up in employment and earnings, even among very low-skilled people, and including the men who were not necessarily on the lease in those developments. However, you do not transform the neighborhood because so many of those people move away. They may just move to the neighborhood across the river, or they may actually take those higher earnings and move to much better neighborhoods. So you get your place-focused strategy gets a great individual effect, really impressive, but it does not transform the place. It makes it into a launch pad as opposed to an incubator. And the third demonstration found, at least in the 1990s, when the economy was booming and most people who had decent job skills and wanted a job could get one, that the people who signed up for this reverse commute demonstration needed a lot more than a commute. They needed other kinds of help to qualify for and stick with the jobs out in the suburbs. And the kind of paratransit solutions that were provided to get them out to suburban jobs were incredibly expensive. They were incredibly inconvenient because suburban job locations are dispersed around the whole metro. And when people did get themselves a suburban job and begin to earn wages at it, they bought a car and didn't continue that crazy, inconvenient paratransit commute they had been provided. So my colleague Rolf Pendel is actually now publishing some results making a strong argument that in addition, where it works, to transit-oriented development and public transportation strategies, car strategies for low-income people are hugely important to opportunity enhancement.
All of this just underlines that sectoral approaches are not going to work. They have to be integrated. You've got to have multi-sectoral approaches to what you're talking about.
Yeah, I also think, so this is a somewhat different point, but that when we want to do rigorous evaluations to figure out, do we get bang for our buck out of an intervention we've imagined, it is sensible to test that intervention in a very stylized way. the way Jobs Plus or Moving to Opportunity did. Of course, in real life, you want to put multiple interventions in place together. You want to mix them up. There's no way to rigorously evaluate the effectiveness of a big multi-sectoral mix-up.
But that's
and
what you
shouldn't
need.
try. So you evaluate piece by piece and then craft holistic strategies and measure progress in outcomes over time.
Terrific. I think we might have some questions from the audience. Do we have questions from the audience? Please come up to the microphone and tell us who you are, and we'll try to answer your questions.
Good afternoon. My name's Grace. I'm actually a graduate student from the University of Pennsylvania. And I have a question for Margery. I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about how a neighborhood that remains poor is left for serve as an effective launchpad to lift people out of poverty, and if you could name any examples in the area.
So I am not as well-versed in Philly's neighborhoods as perhaps many of you are, but I think the idea of a launchpad neighborhood is exemplified by some immigrant arrival neighborhoods in cities all across the country. That there are neighborhoods, that are inexpensive and a little grimy. People come into them when they first arrive in the country or in the city. But there are networks, there are services, there are linkages to help people learn English, get skills, find jobs, get established. Because of those linkages, they're able to get jobs. Some years go by, they're doing better, and they do what generations of Americans have done, translate their economic mobility into residential mobility. And very often there's, there are immigrants behind them moving into that neighborhood. So if you just measured, say, poverty rates in that neighborhood at 5-year intervals, you would see no improvement. But if you looked at a cohort of families that moved into the neighborhood at one point, and where are they 5 years later, 5 years later, 5 years later, they're doing fantastically well. I think that's an important way to think about. It's conceptual. Any real-life neighborhood is going to be a mix of things, but it's useful to think of that as a kind of neighborhood success, even though the neighborhood doesn't look as if it's getting better.
Do you think it's possible to create those kind of networks in the suburbs, like that Elizabeth was mentioning? There's a changing shift in poverty.
Yeah, I think we should have that model in mind, as well as the neighborhood where people really want to stay and it becomes a nice, stable, wonderful mixed income neighborhood. We should have both models in mind in city settings and in suburban settings.
And I think that same sort of thing does already exist, like the way that Marge was just describing. If you look at South King County, south of Seattle, that's where they have a big influx of immigrants and refugee resettlement going on at the same time. And so you have communities that are already sort of playing that role, that people might land there right when they come in, but then they get established with networks, with jobs, with opportunities, and they move next door to a community with maybe a little better housing or a little higher income. So you kind of see this churn around that community, yet they're working, again, as a sub-region to help, particularly in an education context, integrate new arrivals and try and close the education gaps within this multi-community sub-region that's experiencing a lot of that change. And same thing in Montgomery County, which has experienced a lot of influx of new residents. It's becoming increasingly diverse as a large immigrant population, and also rapidly growing poverty in recent years. The county worked together with the local nonprofits, the faith-based community, and the local community foundation to start something called the Neighborhood Opportunity Network, and that was part of the aim was, one, going to hard-hit neighborhoods and having an integrated entry point for services. So that you walk in, you talk to a culturally competent, what they call community connector. You only have to tell your story once to find out, do you qualify for these county services or maybe another nonprofit program nearby, and start enrolling in those programs. But beyond that, they also started a door-knocking campaign to help build networks in communities where they were having a lot of change, a lot of influx, and sort of demographic shifts, to help connect community residents to each other and foster a sense of community engagement and an awareness about, you know, how the community was developing. So they really, you know, put a lot of emphasis on building that kind of capacity within neighborhoods, while at the same time trying to connect people to services.
I think the very point of your research is that these communities are existing and proliferating in the suburbs. The problem is the lack of capacity because they haven't experienced that before. But perhaps the newcomers are choosing these neighborhoods because they perceive that they're marginally better for their children in the education and so forth. And so that would lead one to the question about some of these interventions that have been made in various places, particularly by anchor institutions in education and safety in those neighborhoods. But I think we have another question right there. It's about to, someone else want to ask another question? Please come up, tell us who you are.
Yeah, that's a great question, absolutely. And you know, I love, Paul Jargowski often says we have a vocabulary problem in talking about this space, because there is no one official definition of suburb. In our work, what we've done is, within the 100 largest metropolitan areas, we define cities and suburbs using the official metropolitan statistical area. The first named city in that title is considered a city, and any other named city that has a population of 100,000 or more. And the remainder of the region would be considered suburban. So that's the big picture delineation between cities and suburbs. And this was sort of to strike a balance between, in some research, people choose the one first named city, and that's the city, the rest of the suburbs. Others use census definitions of principal cities. But in a place like Los Angeles, that would be 25 places then would be considered cities. So that this was a sort of middle ground to give a national definition in our work. I think when you actually look within places, and we talk about this in the book, again, suburbs just is too broad a term to talk about the collection of very diverse places outside of the urban core. So we did kind of break out a more detailed typology of what might be higher capacity places versus lower capacity places. Because obviously where you live makes a difference, and that's true in the suburbs as well. Some places are better equipped than others to address these issues.
I think this is really important that suburbs are becoming more and more diverse. And some suburbs may really be fantastic opportunity-rich places to live, and the fact that more poor people of all races and ethnicities are finding places they can live there is really a fantastic thing. Other suburbs may be starting to look like poor neighborhoods of the past in central cities with weaker civic and institutional capacity. So they may be becoming sort of the next generation of concentrated poverty. I think we need to we need to get used to this diversity and begin to make finer gradation. The same is true within cities now. Places we all feel familiar calling cities, I think now have a much greater diversity of neighborhoods within them on really different trajectories. And figuring out what inclusion and vitality mean in these different kinds of neighborhoods is a really changing picture.
And you may remember Myron Orfield's work a decade ago talking about American metropolitics, where he did categorize all sorts of cities and suburbs according to their capacities and levels of poverty and the ability to meet those needs. So there's been a lot of work over the years on this. It's a question of how we translate this into policy, and it's been a little slow going, I think. Yes?
Now it seems to be on.
Very good.
Jeff Hornstein, the Philadelphia City Controller's Office. This is really, really interesting stuff. I mean, obviously, one of the things I'm taking away from here is that there's a huge disjuncture between our political and our economic markets, so to speak. It's an American problem, maybe other countries too, but I think it's a particularly American problem. Obviously, it'd be most efficient to sort of force everyone into the cities, people and jobs, but that's not going to happen, although it may happen organically. But it points to the importance of local leadership, regional cooperation, and something that Eugenie just brought up, this idea of anchors, right? There are anchor institutions both in suburbs and in cities that I don't think have been harnessed nearly to their fullest potential. As procurement entities, for example, we're doing some work in our office now to look at the anchor sector in Philadelphia and how much it procures, and it's over $5 billion a year just in the city of Philadelphia. And if we can localize some of that, we can probably create some more jobs. But you know, producing good jobs is also a policy question, right? There's no such thing as a bad job by nature. Right? Steelwork was once a really bad job, but it became a good job through policy decisions and organizing. Same thing with housing. So I have a question. My question is, what sorts of policies are most likely to produce mixed income neighborhoods? And I live in a neighborhood that's very gentrified already, and we're trying to make it more inclusive and looking for policies that can be implemented sort of at the hyper-local level, things we can do with zoning and other things. At the same time, what sorts of policies would be best to raise the level of job quality? So if anyone has answers to that, I'd be happy to.
Well, so I've been in many conversations at my place of work about strategies for raising the level of job quality, and that's a doozy. I'm going to stay away from it. I'm going to stay over in the housing space that I'm more familiar with. I think that how to create a range of housing options at different affordability levels in neighborhoods is a space where we tend not to spend enough time thinking about the powers of local government. So we've got federal housing subsidies. There's not enough of them. But we could really be focusing on what local government can do with its regulatory strategies. So again, Montgomery County is a great example. It didn't just create inclusionary housing, an inclusionary zoning policy. It went deeper and gave its public housing authority the right to buy a subset of those inclusionary units, so that they ended up with housing developments that had some public housing
This
units.
is Montgomery County, Maryland, not Montgomery County, Pennsylvania.
Sorry, Montgomery County,
Let's make sure
Maryland.
make this clear.
But a very affluent county in suburban Washington area. But it created neighborhoods that essentially have some public housing in them all the way up to high-end single-family housing. So I think that as some of the affluent suburbs begin to see their housing markets weaken if aging baby boomers are selling and the next generation can't afford to buy in those neighborhoods, there are some opportunities to experiment with, basement apartments and auxiliary housing units, subdivision and house sharing options. You could imagine some really creative experimentation around local occupancy and land use regulation that would both support house values and allow younger, lower-income people to begin to live in a community. The last point I'll make is one that I've heard Angela Glover-Blackwell make, which is that when you begin revitalizing a severely distressed neighborhood, you have to believe from day one that you are going to be wildly successful. And you have to essentially pull some of the housing stock out of the market and preserve it as affordable housing. You have to be really foresightful and do that way before the market forces kick in and it becomes too expensive to do it. When gentrification is already way down the path, it's just really, really tough to get in there and acquire properties and make them affordable.
Did you want to
Sure.
respond?
I think that preservation piece is so important, and there's a lot of leadership that can be taken at the local level from different stakeholders to help make that happen. So like in the Denver region, where they're having this really ambitious build out of the Fast Tracks program, in the heat of the recession and when markets were down, you had the Denver Transit-Oriented Development Fund.
Do we really want Denver here at this conference? I
Come-
mean, I hate to be
Well,
difficult,
no.
but we're talking about
There's no reason this couldn't be.
revitalizing
This has been
industrial cities.
okay.
I don't
Asterisk.
mean to
This has been
interrupt you.
replicated in Chicago. It's been replicated in older industrial areas because it's the tool. It's the mechanism itself. That you had local nonprofits. You had local foundations and banks come together, like leverage that public and private money to before the market heated up, before the implementation was fully underway and prices were rising, they bought up property to be able to preserve it around these planned transit corridors. So that's, again, that foresight and the ability to bring public and private dollars together. Even if you don't have elected officials necessarily showing leadership right there, that's a way that philanthropy, the business community can help kind of be the leader in making those situations happen.
Didn't mean to interrupt.
No,
I just
that's
wanted
all
to
right.
make sure that we stayed
No,
focused
fair
on
point,
our
fair
topic
point. That's
here.
something that's
As
being
far-
used
as far
elsewhere.
as that goes. I think we have time for one more question.
Can I make it too? It's sort of the same question. I'm Erin O'Keefe. I'm from Loyola University in Baltimore. And my question really goes back to Margery in the sense of your point in terms of place and people is key, and I think a lot of us see that. I think one of the issues that we find, at least in Baltimore, is that we're talking about two different cultures within organizations. I think community development folks get place, and I think in some sense get people. I think one of the strategies that is missing is that the funding community, in some sense, at least to the people-based human services, human development folks, don't see that as a value. And so strategies in that sense that we can strategically change that over time. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think I share your feeling that many, I think the fair housing movement gets that place matters. They get place. They have different culture of strategies for tackling it, but they get it. And I think, those are hard conversations to bring those organizations together. I know it's hard, but I really think we have to do it. But I agree, I've also had a lot of experience recently with the folks who have spent their careers on social service programs and cash support programs, and they don't think place. They don't think neighborhood. They think about the county that administers the program. So I believe that some of the new research evidence can really help us here. I think, these Raj Chetty findings that say the extent of segregation and poverty concentration in a metro seems to be driving a problem that we all care about. That's a starting point for a conversation. I think this growing evidence of the damage that exposure to trauma, particularly to violence, does to the development of children's, it messes up our brain development in ways that ripple through the rest of our lives. So you can start to think about the horrible damage done to huge numbers of kids who live in violent places. And finally, Patrick Sharkey's book, Stuck in Place. Many people who care about poverty didn't read it because it seems to be a book about race. But it is about the intergenerational persistence of poverty, largely attributable to severely distressed, high poverty neighborhoods. So I think those are starting points for bringing those people into the room and getting them to recognize that maybe they should care about your issues in order to advance their issues.
This has been a wonderful conversation. We've only scratched the surface. We didn't get to ask them what makes the best mix of incomes to reduce poverty concentration, but we'll do that in the hall. I think we want to thank them very much for providing a reframing of the issues of how we reinvent older communities and how we bridge growth and opportunity. So please give these speakers a hand.